So let's give a warm Fairfield welcome to Hannah.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming out here to see me tonight and for taking your evening to listen to me. I really appreciate it. I wasn't expecting quite this big of a crowd, so thank you. So some of you might be wondering what this lecture titled How to Communicate, Not Debate with People Who Don't Share Your Political Views is going to cover. And I'd first like to clear that up by explaining the history of this lecture and how it came to be. This information, as Fred mentioned, was originally presented at the 2nd Congressional Democratic District Workshop, and as was the case there, everyone is welcome, be you Democrat, Republican, Independent, Liberal, Conservative, or somewhere in the middle. One layer of this lecture is about how to have a civil conversation around politics, and that information is valuable to everybody. Another layer was to give participants the tools they needed to take back to their communities and their districts to get people to vote blue next election. So as such, the discussion examples are going to be framed as appealing to voters from a Democratic perspective. So please don't take it personally if you're not a Democrat, you're still welcome here. Given the interest in this topic, we might try and do a more general discussion later, like in the fall or the winter, but I just really didn't have time to prepare all that, so I'm sorry for that again. But yeah, so let's get right to it then. So the original title of this presentation was going to be How to Argue Effectively, and we changed it for a litany of reasons. The main one being that arguing not only refuses to change someone's mind, but usually leaves them more solidified in their beliefs. So tell me, when was the last time any of you had an argument with somebody about the last presidential election and got them to regret their vote? I saw one hand out of all these people, so I think that's very telling. So the reason is that arguing is by nature combative. You don't argue with a person, you argue with an opponent. You don't leave it with a better understanding of the topic that you discussed. You usually walk away from it angry and just more determined in your viewpoint, sometimes regardless of the facts. So case in point, several years ago, some researchers concluded that arguing was actually our species' way of gaining dominance rather than seeking the truth. So I'm sure we've all experienced this in ourselves or witnessed it in others. This is a relic of survival instinct and a clear example of how tribalism still affects our psychology. In fact, studies have shown that sections of the brain which light up during an argument are similar to the ones that light up during an actual physical fight. And this makes perfect sense. If you've ever had a particularly tenacious or heated argument, you might find yourself shaking afterwards or needing to pace for hours just to calm down. And that's a symptom of an adrenaline rush, also known as fight or flight, which is what happens when we are physically threatened. So same instincts going. Does everybody follow me on that? Awesome. So arguing is fine some of the time. It can serve as a healthy expression of anger, provided the argument sticks to words and nothing more. And it doesn't matter if we're arguing about something like which Star Wars movie we think is the best. But it can be downright destructive and harmful if the topic is politics. Now, I believe that Democrats have an amazing platform. We support healthcare, families, education, the environment, LGBTQ rights, racial justice, women's rights, the minimum wage, like all this stuff. And yet we're losing votes. I would posit that the reason for this is because the average voter doesn't know what our platform even is, let alone how it aligns with their own values. And I would further suggest that we, as Democrats, are not successfully communicating our platform because we're arguing it. We're telling people why they're wrong instead of why we find ourselves in the right. We're talking about why they should fall in line with us instead of what we want to do to help them and everybody in this country. And when we do that, we just push people further and further into the mindset of our political adversaries where they are ripe for exploitation. So what we're learning today isn't how to argue. It's how to communicate, how to discuss, and most importantly, how to listen. I believe in what we as Democrats stand for, and we shouldn't be afraid of an honest, open discussion. Petty defensiveness is for those who question their own values. So, at the workshop, I tried to have a PowerPoint to give different title cards. That did not work out, so I'm going with this super high-tech solution right here. As you can see, this is cutting-edge technology, and I hope you appreciate just how, you got it? I'm not going to make you stand there and hold it. Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm good.
This is a long speech.
Thank you, Richard.
So as you can see, it says, oh, no, we have that. That's the wrong way. So as you can see, the first title card, now that it's in the right order, is recognizing your own subjectivity. So as much as of a shock as this is going to be to everyone here, our psychology doesn't work differently than anybody else's. So when we feel there's an attack either on our views, our persons, or the people we care about, we get defensive. That flight or fight response is going to get triggered, and it's just human nature. So we need to be able to recognize when this response is happening so we can rein it in and have a productive conversation instead of just lashing out. So we mentioned tribalism before, and it is an affliction that affects us all. And thus our first step to having a discussion with someone who disagrees with us is recognizing our own internal prejudices. And boy, do us Democrats have some prejudices concerning the average Trump voter. We might be enlightened on issues involving minority rights and sexuality and an array of other topics, but we are mighty close-minded when it comes to those who, rather than being hateful, might just simply be ignorant. We need to make sure that our sense of justice doesn't allow us into snap and possibly inaccurate judgment. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on this. Just so we're clear, folks like Richard Spencer, David Duke, and Ted Nugent are despicable in the worst kinds of ways. They're also avid Trump supporters. Now, calling these three individuals racist, bigoted, and misogynistic is accurate. But how quickly do we as Democrats accuse all Trump supporters of racism, bigotry, and misogyny based on no information other than how they voted in November of 2016? Until an individual proves themselves to be such things, do not assume they are such things. Give them the benefit of the doubt. If we want our words to maintain meaning, then we need to use said words accurately. Otherwise, we are just in a deeper version of the Orwellian nightmare that is the current state of our country. So, if we call every Trump voter a racist, the word racist loses meaning, and suddenly Spencer, Duke, and Nugent are all off the hook, and those men do not deserve such an easy pass. In addition to the theoretical reasons for checking our prejudices, hurling insults, even if they feel vindicating and accurate at the time, does not make for a productive conversation or even a productive argument, and I will touch on what a productive argument is in a little bit. But for now, it's important to be aware of our own prejudices and assumptions before you even go into a conversation. If you talk or correspond with someone with your mind made up about who they are, what they believe, what they care about, and where they stand on every single issue, you're not going to have a conversation with a person. You're going to have an argument with a straw man. And that's not a logical fallacy that we can really afford right now, especially given the divided state of our country. So, find it. No. Yeah, it is. Got it. I need to just listen to you. So as you can see, that says, before you speak, listen. All right, and so now that we know of our potential prejudices and our psychological tendencies toward tribalism, we're ready to go forth and convert the heedless masses into informed voters, right? Not so much. You cannot have an honest discussion if you go into it rehearsing what you're going to say and what the other person is going to say. That's not really a conversation, that is a performance. And that is a performance into which you just cast an unwilling participant, and it will not end well. In order to have a productive conversation, you need to be able to listen as well as speak. To keep your negative assumptions about the person you're conversing with in check, begin with the understanding that we all want what's best for our country, and everybody in it. We just simply have a very different idea as to what is best and how to get there. Remember that you need to listen to what the person has to say. Don't assume you know what they think or even why they think the way they do. If they see that you're making an effort to listen to them, they're likely to return the favor, which in turn gives you a much clearer avenue of communication. Now, contrary to popular belief, Showing that you're listening does not, in fact, mean maintaining unblinking eye contact for an undisclosed amount of time. It means being empathetic to what they're saying by understanding their feelings or logic, even if you don't agree. Ask questions in a non-judgmental and non-confrontational way if you don't understand. Ask questions anyways to show that you're interested in what they have to say, because frankly, you should be interested in what they have to say. And before you address a certain point, maybe repeat back what they've said to make sure you're hearing them correctly. Our minds have a tendency to play a game of telephone with our understanding of what people are saying, so verify that you have a correct understanding of what they are saying so you can understand what they're trying to communicate to you. This repetition can also safeguard the conversation from becoming an instance where people talk past or at one another instead of to each other. And it might be that you don't really get the chance to talk about your party's platform or our policy ideas, and that's okay because you communicated something far more important and far more effective. That you care. You prove that you're not some elitist who thinks they know what's best for everyone, but rather a compassionate citizen who wants what's best for everyone. You created the start of a dialogue, made a good first impression, and planted a seed. And though 2018 might seem right around the corner, you have a year and a half to nurture and grow that dialogue and continue fostering mutual respect and mutual understanding. And that is how we move forward. So, next slide. Thank you. I appreciate your patience as we figure this out. All right, so this says promoting the platform for the people in the back. Right, so we've checked our tribalism, we've opened a good line of communication with the person who disagrees with us. So it's time to pitch our platform and all its minutia. Not so fast. Remember, nobody wants to hear talking points or a sales pitch. There's a reason the used car salesman archetype conjures feelings of ire and disgust among all Americans, regardless of party affiliation. So rather than launching into a speech, bring up your platform only as it relates to the conversation. This is where listening, understanding, and empathy are going to be absolutely crucial to communication. It will allow you to find the heart of their concerns and address said concerns. If someone is complaining about having to pay taxes when they barely have enough money as it is, respond with empathy to their plight, but mention that, while Democrats do believe in funding the government through taxation, we also want higher minimum wages and better employee protections. We think if you're working 40 hours a week, you deserve financial comfort and security. Rather than get bogged down in a question of taxation and its ethics, how it's utilized versus how it should be utilized, address the heart of their concern. In this example, the main concern of your dialogue partner is, I'm working my butt off and I'm barely able to survive. That's the issue that has them worried, and that's the thing that you want to address. So let's try another example, and I'm going to invite audience participation because I'm not so vindictive that I'm going to make you listen to me talk nonstop for 45 minutes to an hour. So I'm going to be your discussion partner, and the topic of climate change comes up. And you're just going to respond. So is everybody ready? Okay, here we go. I'm not really interested in global warming. The science seems iffy to me, and I hear our planet goes through natural and warming cooling stages anyway. I think worrying about things like emissions and light bulbs is a waste of time when we have much greater concerns. How do you want to respond to this person?
What's your concern?
Perfect! What is your concern? Is that what everybody else was going to say? What are you going to say?
I actually had this conversation with a neighbor of mine back in Maryland, and he was completely believing that it was a hoax and everything. I said, the scientific theory was actually first proposed more than 100 years ago. And he was like, wow.
That's awesome. That's great. That also shows that he was willing to listen to you and have a conversation too, and be receptive to what you're saying, so that's perfect. But yes, in here we need to ask what the concerns are. They said they're not worried about global warming right now because they're concerned about something else. And as we discussed, what are those concerns? So say they answer like this. Well, our economy for one. We need jobs and good paying ones. I care about the environment, but we can't do anything if we're all struggling to survive ourselves. So now what would you say to us?
Absolutely right.
Okay, but what would you want to say to them to get them to vote for green energy?
Creates a lot of jobs.
There you go.
I don't know exactly how many, but it's a lot more than fossil fuels right now.
That's great.
It's a growth market.
There you go. All right, so see, we didn't actually need to convince anybody that climate change was real. We just needed to convince them that voting blue would address their concerns about jobs. And it is considerably easier to convince someone to change their vote than to change their entire existential understanding or their deep-rooted ideology. So retired Berkeley professor George Lakoff summarizes this idea nicely. Voters don't vote in their self-interest, they vote their values. So our job isn't to change people's values, it's to show them how the Democratic platform already aligns with these values. But the takeaway here is we can't convince someone to change their vote if we don't know what their concerns and values actually are. It's our job to discern those concerns and values and address them accordingly. So let's try another example. A sticking point for a lot of individuals at the voting booth seems to be the issue of abortion. Yes, this is a contentious topic, and yes, discussing it is going to feel like jumping right off into the deep end. I feel like that bringing it up right now. But we have to be able to talk about subjects that are uncomfortable if those subjects are important to people. So out of curiosity, how many people have heard or read or possibly even felt some sentiment of, honestly, I agree with the Democrats on almost every issue, but I'm pro-life, and I can't really get behind someone who supports abortion? Quite a few. Okay, so a few hands are coming up. I've heard it from multiple individuals in different locations over the years. So the question is, how would you approach a sentiment like this?
Actually, I have an opportunity to do that today on a Facebook post, and so I found two citations. Number one, that abortions at this point are the lowest they've been in a generation. And second of all, the rate of abortion has much more to do with access to health care than anything else.
That is a good point, but
Did everyone hear that?
No.
No. Could you,
I will-
could you repeat that?
I will say it. So he pointed out that abortion is as low as it's been in quite a bit, and that the abortion rate has more to do with healthcare access. And these are good points, but the first thing I would actually do in this situation is ask them what they mean when they say they're pro-life. Because, and your points are valid, and that's exactly what you should bring up.
I didn't have an opportunity to do that. I would have.
Right.
I think
Absolutely.
I would have done that had it been a real person.
Had it been a real person. That's usually how it is.
On a Facebook deal, but yeah.
That's usually how it goes. And we're going to talk about Facebook too in a bit, so that's going to be awesome. But the reason I say this is because pro-life can mean anything from Joe Biden still supporting reproductive access and healthcare to a person blowing up an abortion clinic. Like, it's a pretty big spectrum, so you need to kind of figure out where somebody falls on this, because this could be a thing where they're not going to budge, but you kind of need to know where they're coming from and what they mean by that. You need to understand why a person is applying that label to themselves. So for the sake of example, let's say this person that we're talking to, after some clarification and not haranguing, answers something along the lines of, well, I'm not opposed to abortion if the mother's life is in danger or something like that. I just don't want it being used because someone was irresponsible. I don't like how often it's used. And that's where your thing about how it's as low as it's been, in generations, that's going to be very good to bring up. What's some other points we could bring up?
I have a question. A lot of people who say they're pro-life, their argument is that it's a religious thing. And my point that I always want to shove down their throats is that it's a choice. Gosh, now I'm blanking. I've written letters to the editor about this. Now I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it.
About choice.
Well, it's a choice to believing that life begins at conception is a belief, and believing that life begins at at birth is a belief. They're both beliefs. So how can you try to force your belief down my throat?
That's a very good point.
And will they listen to that? These people
They
don't
probably, like, deep breath. Okay, the thing is, you've got to understand that nobody abortion is bad or that life begins at conception because they're bad people. A lot of people believe this because of their circumstances, it's how they were raised, it's what they believe in, and they've never really gotten the opportunity to question those beliefs in a safe place. Because remember, if they're having an argument, they're going into flight or fight. They're not going to listen to anything you say, they're going to be defending themselves. So you kind of have to like get them, you kind of have to like, you know, sort of extend a hand, promise you're not going to jump down their throat, even if you feel like they so deserve it. And, you know, just kind of listen to what they say. And if they say, well, like, it's my religious beliefs and things like that, one of the points you could bring up is, okay, but do you think it's okay? Like, I get that and I respect that. You always should, like, confirm that, too. You always need to confirm that you're hearing what they're saying and that you understand what they're saying. So you can say, like, I get that and I respect that. I understand where you're coming from. But the thing is, my beliefs don't dictate that. And, you know, my beliefs, like if I'm talking me personally, I might say my beliefs are I believe in a good death over poor quality of life. And so if I have like a fetus that is going to die in pain, I think it's much more humane to simply abort it before it has to suffer. And I feel like if we ban abortion access, you're kind of banning me my right to my personal beliefs and my spiritual beliefs. And that's something that you could bring up. So you're opening a line of conversation. And you might not change their mind, but the thing is they're listening to that and they're considering that. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's again like you gotta, it's really hard to trust me because you're gonna feel that fight or flight response too, but you gotta just take a deep breath, listen to what they say, and just try and go with it. Like, meet them and kind of bring them with you. So that makes sense. What are some other things we could say?
I don't know if this is really mean anybody, but the truth is that women who don't want to bear children have abortions, whether they're legal or not. And so what happens is they die at the hands of illicit operators. Yeah. And actually, it's not a modern thing. My mother told me that in Russia it was very common. My grandmother had abortions. You know, it's not like it just came up. It's something that women have been doing from the beginning of history. Exactly. And it's just a question of whether we want to let people die in the process or get diseases or
and that's another thing you can
have
bring
it be
up.
a black market thing. You know.
That is a thing you can bring up too. In fact, you can also point out when they closed all but 4 Planned Parenthood clinics in Texas. I was actually there when this happened. The maternal mortality rate jumped, it doubled. So, I mean, and that's something, and if you bring it up, don't bring it up in an accusing way. The way you said it was actually fine. Like, it was just really gentle, and it was like, well, I see what you're saying, but this is a concern that I want you to take into account. What are some other things we can say?
Just to answer your thing on the Texas thing, because I just read an article that they've come out with more studies, and they showed that by doing that, the abortion rate has actually gone up.
I know, it's kind of funny because it doesn't lower when they do it. It's just kind of federal legislation. That's another thing you can bring up. You guys have had your hands back there for a while.
Okay. I was just going to say that the most potent argument I've found against Republicans who are arguing about abortion.
Do you want to say argument or do you want to say perspective?
I'm not going to go down that path. Where I have found there is an angle of vulnerability is the Turnaway study, which shows that it is the poor and the people who cannot afford healthcare, cannot afford children, who are most likely to be penalized by anti-abortion policies because they cannot travel to somewhere else where they can get an abortion. That means that they have more children when contraception, which they can't access, fails or isn't used. So you end up with more poor people and the outcomes are awful. Mothers end up in jail, children end up in jail, society ends up paying somewhere between $500,000 and $2 million per child that is not aborted in these circumstances. Meanwhile, the wealthy people get on a plane and go to wherever it's legal and safe.
Yes.
So you are penalizing the poor and you are putting huge costs on society from the people that you hate most.
Well, I wouldn't say that because you're assuming then that they hate poor people and the person you're talking with could be poor themselves. So it was perfect until that point. I mean, it's so easy though. It's so easy to slip into that. And another thing you can point out is like, yeah, we're Democrats and we support contraception access. I mean, if you want to look at Colorado, teen pregnancy rate got cut in half because they started giving out contraception. Now imagine what happened to the abortion rate when they did that. You know, and so, I mean, you can kind of like, just in a non-judgmental manner, once you've like figured out where they stand on this, it's like, just present these facts. We've got a lot of things to address this and address these concerns. We're not changing their values, we're just showing how we actually fit into those values. Sorry.
You know, I think it's a good point, because the question you can ask is, are you more concerned about banning abortions or reducing abortions?
Exactly.
That's a good question.
That opens a potential for dialogue where you can insert facts and their facts, and then you're talking about the actual end result they want rather than a means. Banning abortions is a means, reducing abortions is the end result.
Exactly. And what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not American, I'm from Europe. And I was going to say, like the perspective in Europe, that this is not a political issue anymore, more or less like when we get into the elections. Because this is regarded as a human right. And we don't discuss this is no more actually an issue. And I also believe that you should not, like if somebody says that this is a religious issue, you should not, I mean, undermine their beliefs, you know. I mean, you should not address this, you know, because because religion is something that you do not address, you know, you don't undermine. And you go along, and also that people like if you allow women to have abortion, if this is a public access to that, if it is a health right, it does not mean that you promote, that you like abortion, and that you support abortion. You know, we, just as you said, I mean, we all are pro-life. I mean, there is, it really doesn't mean that, you know, it just means that women should have access to abortion, because all the data, everything shows that the abortion falls, you know, once women have access to. So it is not. But I think that in US this issue has been really so highly politicized, you know. Really, it is way too much. I mean, discussed. I mean, this is way back. I mean, I think that in Europe we are much more advanced in this respect.
I think you're right that it shouldn't be politicized.
But it's good to discuss these issues, you know, because like, we'll get there.
Okay, one more.
If I may, because we're talking about a style or form of conversation.
Yes.
Do you think it would be promoting the conversation to ask why this particular point is so important?
Absolutely. I think that will give you such a clear understanding of them. If some people feel like abortion is murder, okay, you understand what they're going for, because then you're arguing, you understand that it's not like a trivial thing for them if they think that. Like to them it's like, okay, well party A thinks that murder is wrong, party B thinks murder's fine, but we're going to lower it a lot with our policies. I mean, it's kind of, if that's like how they feel about it, you can come at it from that angle and understand and be more empathetic to that. And if you're more empathetic to that, like, I mean, again, you just ask questions, just, you know, just try and keep the judgment out of your tone. I have trouble with that myself. Okay. All right, one more.
Well, it's on this point that you're making, because I think if you've got a very, very strong religious belief,
yeah.
I'm for abortion, but I grew up in a Catholic family, and I understand that really strong religious belief, and that can be impenetrable, because that's part of your morality.
Yeah.
And how you see it. So to that point, I think we have to accept that there may be some things we can never change about how somebody thinks on something.
I'm getting to that point too. Yes.
Could I add to it what David said?
if you listen to him, he said you ask him a question. And you get a lot further with people if you, instead of trying to make a statement to them, you ask them a question to get them to thinking and respond. You shut up till they respond. He makes a good point.
Yeah, it's hard sometimes.
Yeah, it is
Because
hard.
you're just like, you just want to be like, no, but. That's why you gotta check that tribalism first. You gotta rein it in. So, I mean, we all talked about like a lot of great ideas and some great great approaches to this. And again, just asking these questions, understand what they're saying so you understand how to approach it, Now, as you mentioned, you are probably going to encounter people whose values might be incompatible with what Democrats have to offer or that platform. And I want to say that that's okay, because when you live in a country as diverse as ours, you're going to meet people who think and feel differently on certain topics, and they're not going to be swayed by different ways to look at said topics. But the thing is, this is okay because at least you understand where they're coming from now. They're not a villain now, You gain a valuable insight as to who they are and why they think the way they do. And they got a chance to understand you and your values as well. You're not a villain to them anymore. You're not some baby killer boogeyman in this instance, So the other thing that you did is you introduced, if you do this, you can introduce civility and mutual respect into a political conversation. And in this day and age, that is a Herculean feat. So, I mean, that's also great. And you might have planted a seed which grows into something that changes their mind later in life. Maybe not next election, maybe not the next 6 elections, but maybe later. You got them to think about something. So, regardless of how your conversations go, remember that they are just that. They're conversations. They're not a debate and they're not an argument. Do not try and force somebody to agree with you or admit that they might have been wrong about a topic. This might even be the first time they even considered the points that you're offering them. And so you need to give them a chance to think about it. Psychologist and Inception director Christopher Nolan all agree that that people are much more likely to embrace an idea if it comes through an internal debate within them rather than external persuasion. So our person sick of taxes might stew on the idea of higher wages for a while and then conclude they wouldn't mind their taxes so much if they had a more considerable paycheck every 2 weeks. Our climate change denier might conclude that if green energy really does create better jobs, then embracing these initiatives is killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Those hippies will shut up and get and our pro-lifer might decide that voting for a platform that can tangibly lower the abortion rate is way more important than the actual rhetoric of the abortion debate. But you've got to let them reach these conclusions on their own terms. And that means you are going to have to be able to walk away from a conversation without any knowledge that you did anything to change their mind. And that's scary, but you have to be able to do it. So just get very used to saying things like, hey, thanks for talking to me. I'm glad we got a chance to understand each other better, and if you ever want to talk again, I would be interested in hearing more about your ideas. Even if you ultimately don't convince them to change their minds, again, you gained a better understanding of them as a person, they gained another better understanding of you, and you just broke down some of that anger and resentment. Yes?
I want to bring up a problem. I can accept talking in a conversation mode with anybody on almost anything, but when they bring up global warming, it's like it triggers something way deep. It's my DNA. It's like it's killing us all, killing our grandchildren, right? And I can't control the feeling. So what do you do there?
If you can't control the feeling, and I understand that because I have triggers myself, you simply say, if you can't have that conversation because it's not good for your emotional health or your mental health, and you're just going to launch into an argument, it's better to say, you know what, this topic means a lot to me, and I can't have a civil conversation about it.
But that's actually the problem with both sides most of the time.
It is, but the thing is, both sides, they just go into that argument. They don't excuse themselves from it. You don't have to change everybody's mind all the time. There's plenty of us who can keep a level head about global warming, and we can have those conversations. You don't have to have every single one. It's okay. I don't expect you to go out and just find every single climate change denier and change their mind. So it's okay. So I know that a lot of what I said can seem a little discouraging, like you're going to have to walk away from it not knowing, you might not change their minds, but I do want to tell you a story that will encourage you to try this out. So y'all might remember back in 2008, California passed Proposition 8, which was a piece of legislation that effectively banned gay marriage. This was a huge shock because this should have been defeated easily. Does this remind anybody of a recent election? So a gentleman named Dave Flesher, who works at the Los Angeles LGTB Center, decided to respond to this loss accordingly. So to quote him, "We decided to stop making assumptions about the people who voted against us and go meet them." Dave and his team went to counties where they lost the worst, and they had 15,000 one-on-one conversations with voters there. Yeah, and so they did everything that we've discussed so far. They kept their assumptions about the people they disagreed with in check. They listened to the people they spoke with, they addressed their concerns, and they asked questions to better understand who they were and why they thought the way they did. And what's really amazing is when they did this, when they presented their own point of view, is that they had breakthroughs. Now this won't happen every time, but they did happen. There is a video of a canvasser literally changing an elderly voter's mind about gay marriage and trans rights in one conversation. So, to quote him again, "It's not us changing their mind," says Dave about his team and his canvassers. "It's really us having a conversation that allows the voter to change their own mind for themselves." Dave calls this technique deep canvassing, and it is now being used by LGBTQ activists across the nation. I prefer to call this technique not being a presumptuous jerk, but Ross not any other thing. So call it what you will, but it does have an impact, and more often than not, it is positive. So, next to the cue cards, we have two more. So the first one is how to deal with a belligerent conversationalist looking for a fight. We're going to get into that. Or how to make an argument productive. My father used to say that life is like an elevator. We're used to its ups and downs, but it's the jerks that bother us. So I'm not stereotyping when I say that when you seek out these encounters, when you talk to people who fundamentally disagree with you, you're going to encounter some jerks. Every group of people has jerks. Certain groups and ideologies attract more jerks than others, certainly, but there's no getting away from the fact that jerks exist and they love looking for a fight. So what should you do when you're looking to have a nice civil conversation and you encounter a jerk? You make that encounter work for you and what we're trying to accomplish, which is changing how people vote and maybe changing how they think. You make that argument productive. So just to be clear, you are not going to change the mind of somebody who is simply looking to argue. We've already established that arguing is not an effective conduit of change, and this is doubly true when one of the participants is looking for a fight. But you can change the minds of people witnessing or listening to this argument. So this sort of spectator argument is more likely to happen on a social media platform than in a crowd, but the rules are the same regardless. I read essays from people who went from hard right to left of center simply by quietly watching these types of arguments. I'd like to give you all a quote from one such essay written by a woman who goes by Christina H. "When someone I disagree with blows apart the argument of some random stranger on my side, it's not me they're responding to, and it's not my reputation on the line. I don't have to worry about hurt feelings or embarrassment or the demolishing of an argument I worked hard on. Someone else takes that hit, and I get to devote more of my brain to the actual point being made. If I'm slightly less racist or abrasive than the guy arguing my side, I can even console myself that I wouldn't have been yelled at like he was because I'm not like him. I'm one of the reasonable ones. The other factor I'm watching for is what I call, who is the real asshole? If the guy on my side is being so rude even I'm put off, and the godless liberal refuting him is being super polite and patient, it makes me rethink the good and evil narrative. Sure, I may just move to, these are very nice people, but just mistaken, but I'll be more receptive to listening to nice, mistaken people in the future, which will give them a bigger opening to further change my mind." So, how do we use belligerent people to make more converts like Christina? First of all, stay on topic. Do not let them derail you with insults or false equivalencies. I've had Facebook discussions where people go on a tangential argument and then accuse me of using feminist logic. as an insult, even if we weren't discussing sexism. So what I personally do in that situation is keep them on point. If they're getting tangential, it means that they're sensing they don't have as strong a point as they thought, and so they want to shift focus so they can win that argument. You can never win an argument. So don't let them do that. They started that argument, so they get to finish it. And it's important to keep cool and not get belligerent yourself. We were kind of talking about this. So what I like to do is pretend that I'm dealing with a coworker. I'm treating them like somebody that, I have to deal with in the future, and I don't want to cross any lines and get myself fired by, strangling them. So, it's like, that's a technique I use. It's like, it just keeps you calm, keeps you patient, keeps you on point. So, truth be told, more often than not, if someone's insulting me, I don't even address it. I think it's a lot more effective to just let the insults hang in the air and speak for the person who used them in the first place. I also don't toss out insults, no matter how justified. Sometimes I might make a joke, but I keep the focus on what they're saying and not who they are, And so remember that you're arguing for the benefit of that unseen audience. You're letting them quietly consider these points, and you need to do so in a way that doesn't leave a bad taste in their mouth. So if somebody says something truly horrendous and truly unacceptable, you obviously want to call out that behavior, and you just need to do so in a way that doesn't turn into an insult or a personal attack. So for example, you can say, that remark was homophobic for reasons X and Y, as opposed to, you're a homophobe. Making the condemnation about the action or the words used instead of about the person doing that action or saying those words will get us a lot farther and do more to encourage others to think about their own behavior. Someone once pointed out that prejudice is a spectrum and you need to shift people out of it in stages. And surprisingly, you really can't do that by hurling insults at them. It's kind of weird. Now, that being said, sometimes a person is so toxic or acts so horribly, or you're having a topic of conversation that kind of triggers you, and it won't be good for your mental or emotional well-being to continue to interact with them. If that happens, don't worry about winning the argument or making converts. Just exit that conversation. You can do so in a civilized manner. Something along the lines of, I want to have a conversation, but if you're just going to insult me and use, derogatory terms, I'm going to have to leave because you don't seem interested in what I actually have to say. And then just leave. Or if you're on Facebook, unfollow that post or thread. You stated why you're leaving, and if they want to respond by calling you a snowflake or accuse you of needing a safe space, let them. To use Christina's example from earlier, it will be pretty clear to anyone witnessing this who is the real asshole. And so finally, my last point, thank you so much for all your patience with this. Here we go. For those of you in the back, it says, remember that you are fighting for the jerks too.
Yeah.
We talked about tribalism earlier, and now we're coming full circle. It's easy to think of those with different political viewpoints as some opposing army that we need to defeat, rather than people who just engage in a different line of civic thinking. But remember, begin with the understanding that we all want what's best for our country. We just have different ideas as to what is best and how we get there. I had a friend of mine who once said that we view politics like a zombie apocalypse movie. We see the other side as this impending horde, and we gotta put up our barriers and keep them back. But he said what politics really should be is a buddy cop movie, where you're two people, you have different viewpoints, but you gotta work together and solve this conflict, solve these problems. And that's kind of that made me really think about how I was viewing my own political prejudices. So remember, we're not fighting for healthcare just so liberals can have healthcare. We're fighting for healthcare so everybody can get it. We don't want green energy so only Democrats can get nice jobs and clean air. We want those things for everybody. So remember that, and don't be afraid to remind people of that. I had a different friend share Jimmy Kimmel's speech about healthcare access in this country on his Facebook page. You might remember it when he was talking about, his son, and they now call it the Jimmy Kimmel test. So another one of his friends responded by saying that this speech was absolutely wrong, it was all about entitlement, and just played on sentimentality. Naturally, he got a lot of responses. People pointed out that no one should die of cancer because you're poor, that they would gladly pay more taxes so kids could get health care, things like that. And he responded with, capitalism ensures a better health care market. The government can't be trusted to be in charge of this. And when his kid got sick, he took out a loan and then just got a second job to pay it off. He didn't need any handouts. So why should he have to do that for others? Now, his opponents pointed out that some people don't have enough time in the day to get a second job, or that they already have a second job just to get by, or they can't even get a loan. But then someone just said, dude, that is so wrong that that happened to you. I want to pay more taxes so that doesn't happen to you or anyone else again. Now, this is real life and not a Disney movie, so the argument didn't stop naturally. But what is interesting is that our belligerent individual who started the whole mess had nothing mean to say to the person who responded with compassion. He just said, I think you're wrong, but I appreciate the sentiment. 2 sentences of empathy did far more to get that person to understand the benefits of universal health care and why people support it than comment after comment of thought-out, well-reasoned argument. And that's the crux of it. What should anger us isn't that this person doesn't like the idea of universal health coverage or single payer. It's that in our country, this individual had to take out loans and work a second job to care for a sick child. That is what should infuriate us, not just as representatives of a political party, but as human beings. The point I'm trying to make is that no matter what, we need to remind people that we, as Democrats, are not aiming to take. We want to give unconditionally. We want everybody in society to thrive, regardless of their ideology. And we need to remind ourselves of that too sometimes. We want to win an election not just for our benefit, but because we think we have good ideas and we want everybody to benefit from those ideas. So I want to thank you all for coming out here and taking the time to listen to me tonight.
I want to just say 2 quick things first, if I
sorry.
may. First is this is as good as we got for donation jars to help cover the costs. And Randall at the back has a couple of these. If anybody feels comfortable, fine, and if you don't, that's fine.
No pressure.
And I just forgot I was going to do this at the beginning. Let's thank Bruce Grady and his friends for recording this talk. He's amazing.
Do we have some questions?
You bet.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can go for to almost a half hour if we have that many questions.
Great. I'm going to take a drink of water. I hope y'all don't mind.
Okay, so you were just touching on something that I think, I don't know if you missed it, but I think it's important, and that is that what we've been talking about is logic. Like, here's why you should change your mind, and logic, and here's why you should be concerned about global warming, and here's logic, and here's why you should be concerned about global warming, and there's logic, right? What really makes people change is feelings.
Well,
I want to say a point of view on this, okay?
Sorry.
Is that if let's say in the idea of abortion, you might say, if I was in the position of a poor person, right, who was afraid, was going to have to seek an abortion, if I was in her position, I would feel terribly afraid. Wouldn't you, if you were in her position? How would you feel? So you make them be empathetic. Is that a valid point?
That is a valid point, and there's actually been studies about this. It is better not to use a hypothetical, but rather use real-world experiences. People can dismiss hypotheticals pretty easily because, well, they're hypotheticals. We're talking about non-existent people. So if you're talking about somebody that you knew personally who desperately needed an abortion, that would be a pretty valid point. And I do want to add, I know that we talked about logic, but the reason, and we kind of brushed over this, and the reason is because I don't want to make suppositions about people and generalize them about why they feel the way they feel. But it is really important to make that emotional connection first. And like I said, if you're having a conversation, you might not even get to the logic. You might just be going back and forth and sharing your experiences and talking about your feelings and, maybe gazing into each other's eyes a little bit, but you're going to make that emotional connection first. It's really important too for them to see you as a person and not just this straw man that they want to knock down. So what you're saying is absolutely valid. That empathy is important. I would only just add to it that it's really important to talk about personal experiences because they can see you're a real person and you're talking about other real people. And it makes them a lot less hesitant to kind of lash out, which is why, on the internet people are a lot more vicious, and that's just, again, because they don't see the other person there. I used to work I did a lot of customer service jobs, and one of them was a phone support tech, and I can tell you, people were a lot angry at me, a lot more angry and a lot more unreasonable with me when they were on the phone with me than when I was standing in front of them. So, I mean, empathy is absolutely key to doing this. That logic won't mean anything unless they're actually listening to you and seeing you as a person, too. So, yes.
I don't know whether that you know that Patty Judge, who ran for the Democratic nomination for the Senate, that she now, she had some money left over from the campaign, and she has started a nonprofit group where they are going around and speaking to people who live in rural areas and are pinpointing the people who were independents or Democrats who chose then to vote for Trump, to vote a Republican ticket. And we're going to be having her come to our Indivisible group in September over in Ottumwa. And I think it will be very interesting to hear those conversations too, because it's much like what you're talking about, where, you know, wondering why people changed or what were the reasons. And I just wanted to mention it, and I know you can look her up on Google and find this without me giving any information. But I just think what you're saying and what you're doing is so wonderful. And there are people that are talking about it, and the question is, how do we do this? And, you know, what are the stories that we tell? So
When she speaks, will we know? Will we find out?
we'll put it on Jefferson County. Dan's.
There's an Indivisible site here too that you can.
Yeah, okay.
It'll be on the Indivisible site. There's also fairfieldactivism.com, which is a calendar. And we'll be sure to post it there. If you send me the information, I'll be sure to post it.
Yes.
Oh, it was very interesting when you brought up about the customer service. And I thought that's a great way for us to kind of see this in real life. If you've ever called to complain about something or you had a problem with something, thinking back on which customer service reps you really related to. And those were always the ones who questioned you, agreed, you know, said, oh, I'm so sorry, and really I felt like they were hearing me. So I think that's a great thing for me to think back on when I'm thinking about talking with someone, is to go back and remember those conversations and how that person spoke with me.
Awesome. Awesome, whatever helps you. Yes.
Oh, I just wondered if you had studied the Rogerian approach of arguing and if you incorporated some of those, the Carl Rogers ideas and, you know, how to first look at your opponent's point of view and try to acknowledge
I haven't studied them, but I am familiar with them. And like I said, I think debate and argument are great, and I like them as an art form. The only thing is, it just doesn't seem to change anybody's mind. I mean, if you ever go into, like, if you actually see a debate, people are arguing these points very fervently, but the funny thing is, you don't know what that person actually stands for because they're just doing a debate. And it's kind of, I mean, it's an art form, and I think it's important to know this, and especially it's important to know this if you're going to have an argument online, that spectator type argument. But if you're trying to have a conversation, I don't know, it's like, the problem with that is you're assuming their viewpoint, and you shouldn't do that. So, like, it's a lot easier to just be like, hey, tell me your viewpoint. I want to hear about it. I want to know why you feel the way you do, you know? So, I mean, it's very good that when you're dealing with somebody who's unruly, then you kind of need to speculate on where that's coming from.
I just want to say I did that. I had an old friend from here for many years. We really liked each other. We never talked about politics, and then one day we did, and she told me she voted for Trump, and I was very calm.
Good job.
And we were having this conversation online, and I said, oh, tell me, how do you feel that way? What do you see? And the things she said, I got so triggered. I mean, I didn't respond with it, but I just want to warn people that if you really are going to listen to somebody whose perspective is so opposite your own, it's not an easy thing to do. Just to, she said, oh, I like Trump because, and all the men he's appointing in his cabinet because they're successful businessmen and they can run the country more successfully. because they're businessmen and they know how to do business.
Businessmen have always done well by work. But don't actually say that. Yeah, but it can be, I mean, one nice thing about being online is that when somebody says something that's triggering, you can put down the computer or put down your phone, go scream at something, take some deep breaths, and then go do that. It's a lot harder to do that in person. I just noticed that I usually try and focus on my breathing when that happens and just be like, and just try to remind myself this person isn't malicious. This person really does just want what's best, and they just, I don't agree with it. I don't know how they got to that point, but you know, maybe just have a morbid curiosity as to how they got to that point. All right, I'm going to do you and then you.
So one of the problems I have found with talking, listening, conversing with people like that is they'll get started and then it's a rant. And I'm just getting more and more triggered, and they're just, you know, they're off. And so what I have found, and I haven't practiced this so much, but I'm planning to, is that deep listening. To do deep listening, you have to stop them about every 20 words. You have to say, stop. Let me see if I have this right. Is this what you mean?
Exactly.
And repeat back to them exactly what they just said. Don't even change their words. And they'll say, yes, that's right. I say, and go ahead. Is there more? And then stop them every 20 minutes. First of all, it breaks up 20 seconds, sorry, 20 words. It breaks up their momentum, and they feel deeply heard. And it brings them out of that fight or flight thing a little bit.
Exactly.
And,
It's
and
like
it allows them to think, well, I guess I got to listen to her now too.
No, exactly. It's like what we're talking about repeating back what they're saying. That's exactly it. And that's a great idea to break up the rant.
Yeah, but don't wait till they're done with their rant to repeat back what they say, because you'll be too triggered.
You did that with Kelly.
I just was kind of going off what she said. I actually had somebody kind of give me that same argument of, well, not argument, but that same kind of point of view of, well, I think he'll do a good job because he's a good businessman. And I'm thinking, okay, is that actually your point of view, or is that what somebody else told you your point of view should be? And so when I heard you say that, I kind of thought, wait a second, you heard somebody else say that, I've heard somebody else say that, so.
It was actually, I think, our president. I'm a good businessman.
Yeah, so now I'm like, so is that actually what you think? Or now I'm curious.
The way to say that too is like, oh, well, why do you think he's a good businessman?
Yeah, well, at that point in time, I had to kind of do what you said. I had to leave. I actually walked out of the office, down the hallway, out the door, and screamed at the top of my lungs. Yeah, it was about all I could do to keep from just blowing up, but
okay, just
yeah.
one, I promise for the next.
I wanted to also add on to what we both were talking about. After hearing Hannah's talk in June, it turns out I was talking to a friend that I've known for about a year, and was shocked to find out that he had voted for Trump and was a Trump supporter. And we don't talk that often, but we do. It was stunning to me. It was pretty hard. But then I said, okay, Fred, don't talk, just listen. That's one of the things I learned. And then the next thing I thought was, how about asking questions and making sure that I heard. Now, well, here's what happened. I did this 3 or 4 times. So the first thing, and now looking back on it, what I realized is when you ask someone, now I want to make sure I got this right, and you repeat it back, and you've got to just be really accurate. And if you do that, they now hear themselves. They hear themselves, and so one time they said, yeah, you got it right. Another time they shifted the topic. And they did something a third time too, and I thought that was really revealing. And one person, this person said one time that the very similar thing. Well, you know, he's a great businessman, and I think he'll do a great job. But the way he was going into some detail, I realized he doesn't follow the news in the last at least 3 to 4 months. based on what he was saying, and I'm pretty sure that's true. And then I just got a different perspective on how he came to his thinking and feeling, and it was hard for me, but I really got a lot of information out of it. And thank you to Hannah for that.
Yes.
How do you handle, without getting into an argument, when somebody makes like a racist statement? Because I have family members that, are kind of like that. And how do you, without getting, because when I was a kid, we would get into these heated arguments, as a teenager and, in my 20s and what have you. And I mean, you don't want to accept it, but on the
Obviously.
but how do you deal with this so that maybe they start to?
I mean, I like to, like I said, you kind of call out what they're saying without calling them that. So if they are using a racist slur, you can be like, dude, that's really racist to say that. Because you're not calling them a racist, because a lot of people hear the term racist and they think, this makes me a bad person, and I get triggered, and then they don't say anything. Like, I don't know if you've ever heard of the term white fragility. It's like basically anytime you try and talk to somebody about racism in our country and they get triggered and they just shut down, they won't listen to what anybody has to say. And that's unfortunate, but I feel like if you know that exists, you can account for it and just kind of call that action racist. Another thing you can do if they won't stop after being called out on it, you can be like, I'm not going to talk to you if you're going to do this, and make them leave. My dad actually had a racist relative, and his wife visited him and my mom one time, and they were using racial slurs, and my dad asked them to stop. He told them it was racist, and then they wouldn't stop, and so he said, get out of my house. And, he made them leave. And they were really upset about it, but you know what? They never used those terms again around him. And so, I mean, you just draw a line and you enforce it. You just say, no, this is not acceptable to me. And it makes them maybe rethink that, because they're like, wait, if this is something that is such a big deal to this person that they won't even talk to me if I'm using it, it might make them rethink why they're using that and what they want to do with that. So, I mean, that would be... Yeah, sorry, you were first.
Well, I would just say, too, that I think in any conversation or any interaction between people, people just seek acknowledgement. Mm-hmm. You don't have to give approval, but they want someone to acknowledge that they've been heard and that they have a right to their opinion. We always had a thing on the wall at our house when our kids were small, that people will forget what you said and they will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And I think that's so true. It seems fairly simplistic, but people walk away from those interactions, and if they feel less than or demeaned by that in any way, or that their opinion was undervalued, not that you had to agree, but that you at least acknowledge the fact they hold that opinion, whether it's right or wrong. I just think it comes down a lot of times to feelings and acknowledgement. So.
And I think that's a case too, where you can use that deep listening and say, well, let me see if I get this right. You're saying X, Y, and Z? Is that what you think? Did I get that right? And they say, yeah, that's it. You say, well, I don't agree with that. I don't agree. You acknowledge them, good for yourself.
I don't understand how, a lot of what you said seems really helpful. The example that Fred gave and Carol gave, you're dealing with someone who is very ill-informed. You can be I feel like I'm 99% of the time very empathetic and very nice, but how are you ever going to help someone to get them to vote in their own interest if they are never exposed to
that information.
Good information?
Yeah, I mean, and that's, fake news is definitely actual fake news, not I mean, that is, misinformation is definitely a tool of control for the masses. I mean, but the thing is, if you're showing that you're listening, you can kind of maybe try and expose them to that information. Because if you're being nice and you're listening and you're empathetic, they're thinking of you not as a threat, but as a person that they know and that they care about and that they can trust. And you can maybe kind of make those points to them. You could be like, well, actually, I don't know if you're aware of this, but from what I understand of this Senate healthcare bill, this is what's going to happen. And I don't know, that really bothers me because, for whatever reason. It depends on who that person is. And you would know how to better address the people you know than I do, so. And you've had your hand up in the back for a while. I'm so sorry.
It's quite right. There are a couple of little things that might be helpful to some of the people who've been asking questions. One is something my mother, who was a clinical psychologist, used to say a lot, was offense is never given, it's only taken. And if you put that in your mind, I am not going to let this person offend me with whatever it is that they're doing. They can't insult you. They can't harm you. They can only talk. And if you've got that as, I am not going to respond to it, it allows you to get past an awful lot of triggering simply by saying, this is not actually affecting me. And it will work. It really does. I've been fighting for 30 years on the internet. I really understand this environment. And the other one that's really useful that keeps coming up is once you're able to fake sincerity, you really have it made.
That's great. And I think it's actually kind of funny that you bring up, offense is never given, it's only taken. I try, I'm a young woman and I'm also gay, but I always like to think that, if somebody's homophobic or if they're sexist, that's not my problem, that's their problem. And they might try and make it my problem, but I don't have to let them do that, And so, it's kind of, I try and live my life that way. It doesn't always work, but but that's a great idea for a sort of inoculation against these maybe more toxic conversations too. And yes, I'm sorry, you had your hand up for a while too.
3 points, I hope you remember them all. One of them was in regards to what Cheryl, thank you, Cheryl said. I once asked, how can anybody believe Trump or want Trump or anything? And she said, watch Fox News. Because they get completely different information. And I did, I turned it on. All he wants to do is help the infrastructure. He's really, it's good to see what people are hearing that makes their ideas so different than yours.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And then another thing was, I saw a video, I can't remember, on some people in the administration have a specific plan of how to get people on their side. And that is to get them frightened and angry. And they do everything to instill fear and anger. And to know that that is what these other people have been subjected to and are coming from. They've been consciously manipulated that way. I don't know how much you're repeating their words back to them will actually help them. I understand that it will make them more receptive. And the third thing, which kind of fits with both of these, is that the idea that a good businessman can run the country. Is there any way to bring up the idea that the point of a business is different than the point of a government? That the job of private profit is not the same thing as what a government is for? Is there any way to bring that idea up to people that it's not going to be immediately rejected? Or
I'd like to go through those points.
Okay, good.
So the first thing is with Fox News, there's nothing we can do about Fox News.
No, but we should know what they're saying.
We should. We absolutely should.
As much as it hurts us, so you understand why people are thinking what they're thinking.
Yeah.
And where they're coming from. And you won't just bring up your ideas without knowing what they're.
Yeah, I know. And I think the thing is too is to get them, and again, you can also though find out that information by asking them what they're saying and where they're saying it. Like, if I'm on Facebook, I'm just like, oh, can you send me that article? And then I usually end up getting something from Breitbart. Or Fox News, and I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting that you bring this up because I have this source that's blah, 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 and they seem to not agree. But with the fear, too, that's one of the reasons why you kind of, and I know this is awful, but that's why you sometimes have to keep your anger in check a little bit. Because they're scared, they're like on defense, but I feel like that's one way to be empathetic. Like, You know, if somebody is just frightened and they have no reason to be afraid, I mean, isn't that kind of nice to be able to reassure them that they have nothing to be afraid of?
Well, they won't believe you.
Yeah, but maybe not at first, but you can just kind of ask them questions and show that you're listening and like show that you're concerned about their fears, because to me, that is concerning. I don't like the idea of a bunch of people like sitting alone at home, like watching Fox News and being scared out of their minds. That's not a happy image for me. I mean, I don't care if they ultimately don't agree with me. I don't want people to feel that way. And, you know, if I can, even if you can alleviate that fear in one person, I feel like that's worth it. You know, if you can make them feel not frightened and not scared and, you know, help them build up their own defenses so they're not so easily
Well, what they're
manipulated.
afraid of is the same ideas that you are trying to convince them of.
You don't have to convince them that you're right, though. It's kind of like we talked about. You don't need to make somebody believe climate change is real. You just want them to vote for green energy policies. You know, so you don't have to convince somebody. Like my whole thing is too, I say, look, I don't care if anybody has a problem with gay marriage. I really don't. I just care if they're trying to stop me from marrying a person that I love or stop me from having rights that I'm entitled to as an American. You know, I don't care if somebody wants to believe that the earth is 6,000 years old. I care if they want to teach that in a science class. So like, I mean, one of the things I do is I say, look, you can think whatever you want to think. I'm just asking for the right to live my life. And people tend to be receptive of that. So, yes, sorry.
I actually have an awesome real-life example of everything you've said.
Oh, great. I love hearing those.
Very active with Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America in Nevada. I moved to Fairfield 7-8 months ago.
Oh, well, welcome to Iowa.
Thank you. We had a booth at the farmer's market where we talked about gun safety, and often people walked by and said, oh, you're the group that wants to take our guns. Well, actually, no, we're not. Would you like to find out what we are about? And asking questions about their beliefs. We had some intimidation actions happen with people open carrying and trying to scare and setting up booths next to us. But
I've heard about those.
Really and truly, we changed a lot of minds. And in Nevada, we passed the background check bill.
That's great.
And now the Attorney General isn't enforcing it, and that's a whole other story, but it did pass.
It means that the voters, though.
Yes, and the voters wanted it. And as we, in early voting there, you can sit outside and talk to people. And truly, when you ask them, are you familiar with question 1, is what it was on the ballot, they would say, no, I'm not, some. And when you told them what it was about, often the reaction was, oh, well, of course I'm for that. And they went in and they'd come out and say, yeah, I did vote yes on that.
That's great.
So, but it was through asking the questions, listening to their viewpoint, and not letting them intimidate you, that we were successful.
That's
So.
awesome. Well, congratulations. Lisa. They
Thanks.
passed.
Maybe 1 or 2 more questions?
Okay, I saw you.
Hannah's got to drive back tonight.
Sorry.
Thank you. The question of what to say when somebody says, I voted for Trump because he's a good businessman. I don't know what to say, because the guy doesn't pay his employees.
I know.
This is how he makes his money.
I know.
It's like, I want to I'm activated. So what do I do?
Deep breath. So what I like to do is, like, one thing you can do is be like, okay, there's a post office, and then you have FedEx and UPS, right?
Okay.
Now, we could argue that both FedEx and UPS are much better than the post office. But the thing is, the reason they're much better is because there's some things they won't do. They won't deliver packages to rural places. They won't make sure everybody has access to this. They don't make sure there's a flat box rate for everything. So the thing is that government entity isn't about being a good business. It's about providing a means of people to send and deliver mail and packages. That's their function. It's not about being a good business. It's about providing for the welfare. And we could argue that public schools, they are there to set a parameter. They're not there to make money. They're not for profit. They're just to make sure that we have an educated populace. If you want to go to a for-profit school or a private school for whatever reason and you have the money, great. But the thing is, we have that government-public option. And so the thing is, though, when you run a business is for profit. It has never been about public welfare. Even if you look at businesses like Google, which are trying to install fiber optic cables and they're working with city governments to do it, it's great. But again, it's in the name of profit, not in the name of providing for the citizens. You could talk about Starbucks and how, they're a good business and that they're trying to let people get their undergraduate degrees, who work there, and they always provided health insurance, even to their part-time employees. That's all good, but they did it in the name of profit because they realized they could have a higher employee retention rate by doing that. And so the thing is, I feel like saying, he could run the country well because he's a good businessman, that's like saying, well, he could run the country well because he's a good lawyer, or he could run the country well because he's this excellent sheep herder. They're completely different functions. Nobody might be doubting his ability to herd sheep, but unless those skills can apply to that, now I would say a nurse could be a good politician. I would say a teacher could be a good politician. I would say, a social worker could be a good politician because their job is providing for people and taking care of people. And so to say that they're a good businessman, I don't think he is, but that's neither here nor there. They believe they are. You don't need to change their belief in that. You can be like, yeah, but how does business relate to running a country? Business isn't supposed to make our country isn't supposed to make a profit. It's supposed to make sure everybody's taken care of, regardless of the cost. You send a package to the middle of Appalachia, and the post office will do that, even though it costs them a ton of money to do that. They'll do that at a reasonable rate because that is their function, is to make sure everybody is accounted for. Maybe not taken care of, but accounted for. And that's not what businesses do. They lay off people all the time for profit. They don't account for things.
So I don't have to argue that he's a terrible businessman. I
No.
can just say that
it's neither here nor there.
As true as that may be.
Government
Statement
is a
could be true,
business.
it's not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Oh gosh, there's
One last question.
okay, there's two. Do you guys want
Or
to
two.
fight over it, or do you?
Do you want to argue over it? How about both of them?
Flip a coin. Conversation is a way of creating new knowledge. And so it's good to be learning the art of conversation, or at least how to avoid the art of bad conversation. Because what's happened is we've neglected civics for 40 years, 50 years, however long. And just all these uncomfortable conversations are an opportunity, a huge opportunity.
Thank you. And what were you?
First, let's thank Hannah again. And it didn't occur to me till I was sitting here and I thought, we could have had a feedback sheet for people to fill out. But if anybody would care to provide feedback to Hannah, to me as one of the organizers, please feel free to. And if you don't know my email, it's fred@osagecomputing.com, O-S-A-G-E, computing. And be happy to get any feedback or any suggestions for improvements or for the future. I'm hoping that we could bring Hannah back when she has some time to make this talk more general and less from a democratic point of view, so to speak.